Becoming a Techno Wizard, and today we are continuing our series of Hegel, learning about the phenomenology of spirit. And last time we left off on section 61 to 63. So I'm going to read the description. A little tired today though, so try to speed this up. We'll see. Hopefully, I get into it. Um, in my description for the last section, I said Hegel breaks down the subject predicate relationship in these sections, visualizing the process in which the subject is lost in the predicate, but is then recreated or rediscovered in a subject that is substantiated through the predicate. He uses examples like God as being and the actual as a universe to show how this works. God as being redefines the concept of God as the substance of being in and of itself. Thus, God exists as surely as existence itself. Similarly, when something is actual to a person, it is likely when it is also applicable to another person. Thus universal, and that it exists beyond its conception and it's in one's own mind. Hegel goes on to critique academics who proclaim some philosophical writing as unintelligible, when in reality they just refuse to actually go through the process of understanding the context and depth of the philosophy, perhaps because of a reluctance to accept the substance of the subject it redefines, or due to an inability to grasp the details. Dr. Sadler further explains this section through the lens of modern day issues that seem to be very similar to Hegel's time, such as are where seemingly educated people dismiss philosophical texts they don't understand simply because they don't want to go through the laborious process of understanding it. So yeah, it was a long explanation, but let's see how it stacks up to um, let's see to Dr. Sadler's explanation. Here we go. He said, to recap the last section, Hegel continues contrasting the speculative or dialectical approach with the argumentative or ratiocinative approach. This speculative approach radically reframes the relationship between subject and predicate, and Hegel uses a musical or poetic analogy of the relationship between meter and accent and rhythm to illustrate this relationship. Yeah, I forgot to bring that in. That was a great um, kind of point there. He also examines two examples of propositions: God is being, and the actual is the universe. Is a universal. Sorry, that's what he said. Showing how these are handled in the mode of speculative philosophy. Part of the dialectical process is that the subject disappears or finds its full meaning or essence in the predicate, which in its turn becomes something like a subject in itself. Hegel points out that the inevitability of doing speculative philosophy and natural language explains a complaint often made about philosophy, that it requires rereading in order to be understood. Yeah. So great stuff. Great stuff. So without further ado, let's jump into the new. I like
One
that.
difficulty which should be avoided comes from mixing up the speculative with the ratiocinative methods, so that what is said of the subject at one time signifies its notion, at another time merely its predicate or accidental property. The one method interferes with the other, and only a philosophical exhibition that rigidly excludes the usual way of relating the parts of a proposition could achieve the goal of plasticity.
Oh, that was a short section. Short.
This is a very short paragraph, and I don't think that there's an awful lot that has to be said about it at this point. Some of what Hegel is doing here is just sort of summarizing and review for us, but it's worth hitting on very quickly just to reinforce these notions in our mind. Before that, there's a term that he's using that I want to clarify, in part because it's come to mean, or it's come to have a lot of different associations for us than it would have had in his time, and that word is plastic, and it's a direct, cognate to the German Plastisch here, and when we, late moderns are thinking of plastic, what comes to mind? This is a great example actually for Hegel, because in Hegel's time, it would have meant something that's an adjective which describes a certain kind of state. For us, it's actually become a substance. It's become substantified. This is one of those examples of something becoming actual and then attaining a kind of universality for us and a concreteness that it didn't have for Hegel. They would talk, for example, about the plastic art. Sculpture as being a prime example. What is the sculptor doing? You can think of the marble sculptor who's chipping away at things, but think in part of the one who's working in clay. So you're molding things. You're bending them. That's what it is to be plastic. So when people started experimenting with the kinds of substances that we call plastic, which is a ubiquitous part of our life, there's plastic in my buttons on my shirt. Um, there's some bits of plastic, I'm sure, in this somewhere along the line. Maybe the varnish is in some way some plastic. We're surrounded by plastic
and
as substances,
microplastics
and in all different kinds of forms.
inside
There's
of
it
us.
being soft, there's it being super hard, everything in between. Why is it called plastic? Well, because it's moldable. That's what makes it so versatile for us. That's why it's become such a major part of our environment.
Right.
Something that's destroying our environment as well, our physical, natural environment.
Yep.
You can do molding with plastic. You can make it into the kind of shape that you want. So how is Hegel bringing that? He's talking about our minds having that kind of plasticity, and a philosophical exposition that rigidly excludes the usual way of relating the parts of a proposition, that would attain a goal of plasticity. We're not going to have that in many cases.
And we call it
This is an
neuroplasticity.
ideal, and the ideal would be to be completely moldable, completely shapeable. So that's what he's meaning there. That's a good thing to keep in mind. Now, he's talking about how the subject is understood.
So brief tangent there, brief little aside here, little fun note, is that even though it's somewhat accurate to deem our minds as neuroplastic, as having plasticity and neuroplasticity, recent kind of studies in this field in neuropsychology or neurobiology, I should say, is starting to find that it's less plastic and more like wiring. And what we mean by that is that, or live wiring specifically. There's this great book called something live wire. The brain is live wire or something. I don't know. But like the point of it was that neuroplasticity makes you think that once you kind of set it in a mold, it kind of stays there, right, until you remold it. And that's why it's plastic in that you can remold it, but it's still set in a mold, right? It stays in a certain area. But that's not exactly what's going on here. It's more so, it seems that every time you're thinking about something, right, and you're always thinking about something, that's why that very idea that you only use 40% of your brain or whatever is complete bullcrap. You use 100% of your brain all the time, but there are different parts of your brain going off at any one time, right? And so what that means is whenever you're thinking about something or in a different part of your brain, that part of your brain is firing, right? It's a live wire. It's sending signals in that part of the brain, and that's what makes. And the more it fires, basically the bigger it gets, right? The bigger that part of your brain gets. More, I'm kind of simplifying here, but in addition, the more things it connects to. So when you connect an idea in your mind, like a memory to this, like you're literally kind of making connections in your brain. Like it's, you're connecting like these wires from one place to another, like a giant switchboard. But those wires aren't themselves, like plastic. It's almost immaterial in a way. It's just electric signals going back and forth. And yes, you can see this in the brain structure, but more so it's in the electrochemical soup, right? That is your brain. And so what that means is that when we say your neuroplasticity, what we should be saying is how often you've been thinking about a thing, how often you've been doing a thing, right? So for instance, for older people, right, the idea that they have less neuroplasticity, yes, it's true, but a more accurate presentation of that is to say that they have thought about a certain thing so often and for so long that it's not just that it's molded in place, it's that it's reinforced. It's a signal that's reinforced, I guess you can say, right? So in order to change that signal, right, you have to do another signal that's kind of just as strong, or kind of almost peel out those signals into other ways, right? And it's a kind of subtle, kind of distinction here, but it is important because when we think about neuroplasticity, especially with older people, we think that, oh, people are set in their ways, and they can't change. But no, they can change, and they change all the time. It's just that, if you're not thinking about, if you're not trying to change in a different way, it's going to be harder to do that change, right? Because you're not thinking about it. You're not firing in those new ways. So this is an interesting way, and I find it very cool to see, very intriguing to see how it touches this like philosophical standpoint. And remember, this is from the 1800s, right? Hegel was talking about the brain in this mode before neurobiology was even like a thing. So philosophy, shows you that philosophy is just another part of science.
and two different modes of thinking. These are Weise, ways. Translated here as modes, but you can think of this as methods. So we have the ratiocinative or argumentative approach, raison ierenda. We've seen this used a lot. This is the typical sort of enlightenment way. It's also the sort of gotcha reasoning kind of way. It's often quite negative. Remember, it can lapse into vanity or futility. It's something that's always available to us. We can always criticize. We can always point out problems. We can always, draw conclusions. We can always reason things out. But that doesn't mean that we're always getting at the reality or the truth of things. Sometimes it leads us astray. Then we have the speculative or dialectical way of approaching these things. And they're both working with subjects. They're both working with grammatical subjects. And so how does the ratiocinative approach? It connects it to predicates. It connects it to accidental properties, predicated of it. I am here in this place at this time. I am also on your video screen at whatever time you're watching this, or whatever. It could be years from now that you're watching this. Those are accidental properties. They're not really essential. Another thing that you could put over here is that speculative deals with the essences. That which really matters, that which is really at the heart of things, that which changes things, that which is most relevant. The notion, the begriff, the concept that the dialectic works with, that is to be found in the speculative way of looking at the subject. So the goal is to turn this stuff over here, when we run into it, into this, or to bring it in there. But sometimes it has to just consist in saying, nah, sorry, you missed it, you didn't get it. You're reasoning stuff out, but you're just not getting it. Again, I've mentioned a couple times in recent videos that some of this can apply to the way I handle my comments. When somebody just goes totally off the rails, oftentimes I don't even bother to engage with them. You know why? Because life is short, and because I want to think things out further. And if they're caught up in this, maybe it's time for them to approach it, somebody else down the line, when they can see the futility of this and they want something more. That's really all there is to be said about this section.
Good point. Can't argue with everybody.
As a matter of fact, non-speculative thinking also has its valid rights, which are disregarded in the speculative way of stating a proposition. The sublation of the form of the proposition must not happen only in an immediate manner through the mere content of the proposition. On the contrary, this opposite movement must find explicit expression. It must not just be the inward inhibition mentioned above. This return of the notion into itself must be set forth. This movement, which constitutes what formerly the proof was supposed to accomplish, is the dialectical movement of the proposition itself. This alone is the speculative in act, and only the expression of this movement is a speculative exposition. As a proposition, the speculative is only the internal inhibition and the non-essential return of the essence into itself. Hence, we often find philosophical expositions referring us to this inner intuition, and in this way they evade the systematic exposition of the dialectical movement of the proposition which we have demanded. The proposition should express what the true is, but essentially the true is subject. As such, it is merely the dialectical movement, this course that generates itself, going forth from and returning into itself. In non-speculative cognition, proof constitutes this side of expressed inwardness. But once the dialectic has been separated from proof, the notion of philosophical demonstration has been lost. Looking at section 65, it's interesting that Hegel starts out by talking about non-speculative thinking. And there, keep in mind what we're covering, not just, raisonnieren, the argumentative or ratiocinative approach, but also appeals to intuition, common sense, picture thinking. All of these have their rights. All of them have a certain legitimacy to them. All of them have a proper function. It's just when they get substituted for philosophy that we have a problem. And so he's going to say here, he doesn't actually use the word responsibility, but I'm using this in part because we've got this conception that rights of another often entail responsibilities on one's own part. So speculative thinking bears certain responsibilities for itself, for those who are engaging in it, but also in relation to non-speculative forms of thinking. And he gives you a number of different points that I've summarized here. He says, the sublation of the form of the proposition must not happen only in an immediate manner through the mere content of the proposition. So that's one that's important to dwell on. Sublation is this term, Aufhebung. Sublation is just an English way of trying to sort of get the cognate across. What is Aufhebung? We've talked about this. This is a really central Hegelian concept. Aufhebung means a sort of transcendence that incorporates what is being transcended, or at least incorporates its most important moments or parts, and brings about a greater, a higher type of unity, a whole, something that is you might say, not able to be completely viewed from the previous position, the previous shape of consciousness. What's been transcended in this case is the proposition. So how has that been transcended? How has that been sublated? It's been shown to contain the possibilities for a kind of distinction, then a kind of unification, the subject disappearing into the predicate, also being found in the predicate, this non-vicious circularity that we've talked about already. So all that has to be done, he says, not in an immediate manner, that could happen immediately, but in an immediate manner that is in an unmediated way, without sort of thinking it through, without making it explicit what's going on. So he says, on the contrary, this opposite movement must find explicit expression. It must not be the inward inhibition mentioned above. This return of the notion into itself must be set forth. So if we're dealing with a subject that in its relation to a predicate becomes a notion, a concept, a begriff, a self-moving entity whose development we can sit back and observe, or perhaps which is taking place within us, perhaps we're involved in that notion and its development. If that's the case, then what's going to happen is the notion is going to self-alter, it's going to self-other, and it's going to reincorporate what has been othered in that process. That's the process of negativity, of determinate negation. So the return of the notion into itself must be set forth, he's saying. We have to actually make it explicit. We can't just sort of say, well, I'm just going to sit back and watch. We have to document it, you might say. This movement, he says, which constitutes what formerly the proof was supposed to accomplish, that's worth dwelling on. Proof, you notice we're going back now to thinking in terms of this, either reasoning way of approaching things or the one that was modeled on mathematical cognition, mathematical style. Proof was supposed to yield us something that we could be completely confident about, but it's also important because of all the back stuff. You remember back in geometry class, if you guys still do proofs in geometry class,
No.
did you ever get docked for not showing your work? And you say, well, it doesn't matter. All we're interested in is the result. Well, no, the proof is...
That's interesting, yeah. I'm not sure if we called it proofs when I was in school. I remember it was like, you have to show your work and show how you get this, but for some reason, I don't remember the word proofs. That's like, which is interesting. And I was in like advanced classes too, so it wasn't like they were skipping stuff. I wonder if it's a generational thing or a school thing or region thing. But interesting.
The stuff that leads to the result. So what does speculative thinking have in place of that? It has the documentation, the analysis, the watching, the making explicit of what's actually going on in the transition from one shape of consciousness to another one in the dialectic. So he says, this is the dialectical movement of the proposition itself. This alone is the speculative in act, and only the expression of this movement is a speculative exposition. Now, here he's talking about at the level of the proposition, but we can also talk about larger levels as well that this is going to go for. But notice that means that we can also sort of bear down to the proposition itself. The sort of developments that are taking place historically are not something that are totally beyond our grasp. We can express them in propositions. We can express them propositionally in terms of subject and predicate, but we have to be prepared for some sort of dynamic interplay between those. So he says, as a proposition, the speculative is only the internal inhibition and non-existential return of the essence into itself. What does that mean? Here he's talking about, remember back a few paragraphs before, how consciousness gets sort of stymied when the predicate assumes the importance and the subject kind of disappears into the predicate, and then we have to rediscover the subject within the predicate. We rediscover the predicate as having a substantiality to itself. So he says, what is the result of this? Well, we often find philosophical expositions making appeal to inner intuition. And why would they make that appeal? Remember, Hegel's generally going to be seeing intuition as a bad thing. But in this case, maybe he would have good grounds for saying, well, you just have to you have to have the right intuition of it. You got to have developed far enough.
Sorry. My brain is trying to wake up. Calling me to yawn like crazy. Got water in my eyes. I should have took a nap before I did this. Let's get back to it.
There's a certain truth to that here, but it doesn't go far enough. Why? Well, because there's an arbitrariness to intuition that we've already seen, but also because when you appeal to the inner, you're not being fully dialectical. You're not fully taking speculative thinking where it needs to go. He says, they evade the systematic exposition of the dialectical movement of the proposition, which we've demanded. So you can't just appeal to intuition. You have to be systematic, and you have to be systematic in setting out. That's what an exposition is. You're laying everything out and saying how everything's connected to everything else. So the proposition should express what the true is, but essentially the true is subject. This is not something new at this point. As such, it's merely the dialectical movement, the course that generates itself, going forth from and returning to itself. In the non-speculative proposition, proof is what we're looking for. Does that mean that we're not looking for proof at all, beweis, demonstration, in this? No. Proof does have some value. He says once the dialectic has been separated from proof, the notion of philosophical demonstration has been lost. What does that mean? That means that we do have to be engaged in a process where if we're the ones who are in the privileged position, able to look at this panorama of history in a synoptic fashion and see the development taking place, we can't just say that to each other as sort of an Illuminati or intelligentsia. We have to be able to explain this to other rational subjects so that they can also participate in that community of inquiry and they can see what's going on. If we're not doing that, something is falling short, something is not fully being developed, and we should actually begin to be a little bit suspect about our own position, that perhaps it contains some idiosyncrasies, some eccentricities, that it's not as fully developed as it ought to be. In some ways, the test of whether, if we go back to Plato, the test of whether you truly know something is whether you're able to teach it to somebody else. It's kind of funny because, there's that old adage, those who, know something do it, those who don't know it teach.
But basically, like, you have to, make the knowledge accessible, right? Like, obviously there's a fine line. Like, you don't want to, like we said this with the latter adage, you don't want to be like the teacher who just teaches, who only knows like the theoretical. You have to have some of that practical experience with it. But the practical experience in terms of philosophy, in terms of the dialectic, as I'm understanding it, is the concept of trying to grasp these understandings for yourself, right? You're not just reiterating what you read somewhere, or trying to summarize, or just reading a bunch of summaries and be like, okay, I'm going to go teach this. No, it's like you spent the time and effort to like grasp these concepts, to formulate your own opinions, to create a systematic understanding of of knowledge, a solid foundation of knowledge, and you're like, okay, this is making sense to me. Let's see if it makes sense to somebody else. And so you go out and try to teach it to somebody else, and then as you're teaching, you're not just pouring your words on them with your big words and all this other stuff. No, you're drawing conclusions, or rather drawing connections. You're showing how it's related to their life, to their understanding, and if they in turn might critique you and like, oh, what about this? Or, what about that? How does that work, right? And that in turn, should build up your own, foundation, should build up your dialect, right? um, and I think that's a very powerful way of seeing all this, right? We often forget that knowledge is something that you build and create, and it's a process rather than just spouting facts. So yeah, this is fantastic.
Hegel would say that's completely wrong. In order to actually teach effectively, you actually need to know what it is that you're teaching about. And part of what teaching really is taking what is inner and making it outer, making it exterior, laying it out for others, taking the esoteric and making it exoteric, you can say. So this is a very important passage because he's, again, stressing the rights of non-speculative thinking by stressing what it is that speculative thinking ought to do, how it ought to conduct itself.
Awesome.
Here we should bear in mind that the dialectical movement likewise has propositions for its parts or elements. The difficulty just indicated seems therefore to recur perpetually, and to be inherent in the very nature of philosophical exposition. This is like what happens in ordinary proof, where the reasons given are themselves in need of further reasons, and so on ad infinitum. This pattern of giving reasons and stating conditions belongs to that method of proof which differs from the dialectical movement, and belongs therefore to external cognition. As regards the dialectical movement itself, its element is the one notion. It thus has a content which is in its own self subject through and through. Thus, no content occurs which functions as an underlying subject, nor receives its meaning as a predicate. The proposition as it is stands merely as an empty form. Apart from the self that is sensuously intuited or represented, it is above all the name as name that designates the pure subject, the empty unit without thought content. For this reason, it may be expedient, for example, to avoid the name God, since this word is not immediately also a notion, but rather the proper name, the fixed point of rest of the underlying subject. Whereas, on the other hand, for example, being, or the one, singularity, the subject, etc., themselves at once suggest concepts. Even if speculative truths are affirmed of this subject, their content lacks the immanent notion, because it is present merely in the form of a passive subject, with the result that such truths readily assume the form of mere edification. From this side, too, the habit of expressing the speculative predicate in the form of a proposition, and not as notion in essence, creates a difficulty that can be increased or diminished through the very way in which philosophy is expounded. In keeping with our insight into the nature of speculation, the exposition should preserve the dialectical form and should admit nothing except insofar as it is comprehended in terms of the notion and is the notion.
I like that part where he's talking
Here in
about
section 66.
You don't want to focus on like the name of a thing, or like this thing as just a title, or like God, like this is a pronoun. Like when you're saying it as that, you're not really what's the word, engaging, I suppose, with what that is as a concept. Like, what is God as a concept, right? I think that's a much more interesting conversation than what is God as a person, or it kind of goes back to what I was saying in I think the last video about my problems with religion, oftentimes is that people focus too much on like, the text rather than the meaning, the concepts, the philosophy of religion and spirituality that's just trying to be, communicated. So yeah, this is looking forward to see how he gets into this.
Hegel is bringing together several threads that he has previously developed in some of the earlier paragraphs, and he's going to bring us to one of these important crux points. You could summarize it by saying that philosophy, speculative philosophy, dialectical philosophy included, cannot dispense with the fact that it's rooted within language and everything that language then ends up bringing. And so, if it's going to work, it's going to have to work by transforming the linguistic elements, the linguistic parts, the linguistic resources that it has before it, rather than just taking them for granted as the conditions that it has to work under. In this respect, you could say, in a way, that Hegel's phenomenology is the opposite of something like ordinary language philosophy, which developed out of a reaction against idealism in Britain, which had been influenced by Hegel, which took, the limits of language as being the limits of my world, if you want to use Wittgenstein's Tractatus formulation. Hegel is holding out hope for us being able to think through how we're using language. So he says, the dialectical movement has propositions for its parts and its elements. So the difficulty that we've just indicated seems to recur perpetually and to be inherent to the very nature of philosophical exposition. Here he's going to say something about ordinary proof, or proof that's not dialectical, and some of the problems with it that were pointed out by skeptics in the ancient world, and which we can still say are problems today. But I also, before we go into that, I want to point out something else. You might object to Hegel, and you might object to the worries about this, propositions having subject-predicate form. You can say, well, not all language is built like German or built like the Indo-European family of languages that use that. There's these other, languages, and they have their own way of parsing up grammar and the world, and it's very different than our own, and it's, just as original a relation to the world, and so maybe we could model it on those. Maybe we don't have to have substances and subjects and predicates, and there's a certain truth to that. But I want you to realize something whenever you say that sort of thing. Likewise, whenever you talk about what lies beyond language, mystical insights that can't be communicated, you're still using language, and you're still using the kind of language that we in the West have we've become accustomed to using, and it's pretty hard to get away from it. Because if you want to say, there's other languages that are not subject-predicate form dependent, and we should be using those, notice what you're doing. There's other languages, there's your subject, and they're not subject-predicate dependent. You've just done a subject-predicate thing, right? So you're replicating the same problem, you're just pushing it a little bit deeper. And we could go on and on about that sort of thing, but maybe later on. So he talks about ordinary proof, and he says the reasons given themselves are in need of further reasons, and so on ad infinitum. You can say this about logical deductions. Well, why do we have to accept the rules of inference that are used in logical deductions? Why do we have to accept the law of the excluded middle? Can you provide me a proof for that? At a certain point, you have to actually call a stop to that sort of thing, or else you're going to be stuck in skepticism forever. So he says, this pattern of giving reasons and stating conditions belongs to that method of proof, which differs from the dialectical movement. It belongs to external cognition, like a cognition that knows that
the law of the excluded middle. In the logic, the law of excluded middle, or the principle of excluded middle, states that for every proposition, either this proposition or its negation is true. It is one of the so-called three laws of thought, along with the law of non-contradiction and the law of identity. Interesting. Another thing I got to look into.
the thing but stays outside of it, that doesn't penetrate into the phenomenon itself. As regards the dialectical movement, its element is the one notion, he said. It has a content which is in its own self subject through and through. Now, how does that connect up with what he's saying here? He's not making that fully explicit. He says, no content occurs which functions as an underlying subject, nor receives its meaning as a predicate. The proposition as it stands is merely an empty form. That doesn't actually sound very good. But if we think about what happens in the phenomenology, what's been going on up to this point, what's being promised to happen, in these propositions, which are part of the dialectical movement, where we're moving from one proposition to the next, and we also have this interior dialectic taking place, where the subject is getting lost in the predicate, and then getting refound in the predicate, there's this return to itself. You can say that there's this level of sort of complexity, where this is getting assumed into this, and then coming back to it, this is getting assumed into this, and coming back to it. So that is part of what Hegel means by notion, this dynamic, self-developing, complex process that's going to yield us a subject that runs through all of it. So this subject here can't be strictly identified with the subject here, the subject here, the subject here. It's something that's a bit deeper. And guess what that subject is? Well, it's the notion itself. Yeah. Go a little bit further. It's us. It's also us, the knowing, the thinking, the acting, the appropriating subject as well. So now he's going to take a shift in the second paragraph of this section. He says, apart from the self that is sensuously intuited or represented, right? So what is the self that's sensuously intuited or represented? I can look in the mirror and I can see I'm wearing this tie. I can see that I have lines in my face because I'm 44 years old. It's above all the name that designates the pure subject, the empty unit without thought content. He's going to talk about God, but let's stop for a second. Let's use something like this, a piece of chalk. It's worn down halfway through. Chalk. That term chalk, let's write it up here. Interestingly, this is not lexical, but this is the visual equivalent of an onomatopoeia, right? Where the name sounds like the thing, like if I say squawk, right? I wrote chalk out of chalk on the chalkboard, right? So there's a little funny reflexivity there to it. But that word chalk, although it's made of chalk, is not the same thing as the piece of chalk. And if you want to know what the piece of chalk is, you probably should do less of paying attention to the letters and more looking at this actual thing, or look at how the letters were made of this substance that we call chalk. We could say the same thing of many other things. Freedom, for example, when we start predicating things of freedom. So he says, for this reason, it may be expedient to avoid the name God. Why? Why should we avoid the name God? Because we have no idea what the hell it means.
Yeah. See, oh my gosh, it's crazy because literally yesterday, or was it last week? Yeah, it was the day before yesterday on my series talking about my newsletter. I had a section about freedom, right? And I was talking about how a lot of people, especially in America, proclaim freedom, but we don't really know what that means. And in reality, we a lot of people define freedom as, or they don't even define freedom. They just have this vague idea of freedom, right? But no clear definition of what that means, no clear visual of what that feels like or what that looks like, right? And because of that, a lot of people, especially Americans of a certain type, get really down the rabbit hole of perceived freedom and the kind of name of freedom, right? The waving the flag of freedom, but not actually engaging with what it means to be free, right? Like freedom from what? Freedom from who? What? A lot of people think that you can. I don't know if I should get into this right now, but this is anarchy stuff. But like, the idea that you can be free, but you have to sacrifice some equality, right? Some of your freedom to have freedom, right? Like you have to sacrifice, what you can do because you need to follow the rules and regulations of a certain country in order to be free within this country, right? So whenever you get into this idea of freedom, you begin to see the importance of like this philosophy, right? If you don't have a firm foundation of knowledge and how to understand what you mean by freedom, right? How to really build that up, then you're going to have a very surface level idea. You're going to have the name chalk, the name freedom, the name God, but no real critique, no real understanding of what that is. So I love this here.
At least at the beginning. By the end of the Phenomenology, we actually, the penultimate chapter of the Phenomenology is called religion. And we're going to learn an awful lot about what God is, and it's going to turn out that we have a very intimate connection with God. I don't want to give away the secret of the ending if you haven't already read about it in an encyclopedia or something like that. But I'll say this. Stanley Rosen says that if Hegel was an Orthodox Christian, he certainly belonged to a church with only one member, that is himself. And I think that's pretty accurate to say about it. So Hegel says, at the beginning, we should avoid the word God. Why? Because the word is not immediately a notion, but rather the proper name, the fixed point of rest of the underlying subject. People have said all sorts of things about God throughout history, and the name is kind of like a worn-out coin at this point. We're not quite sure what it means or what it can be exchanged for as a subject. What are other things that we can talk about instead of God?
It says freedom.
Being.
That's a great point.
Singularity. The subject. What advantage do those have over God? It says they, at the very beginning, suggest concepts. They suggest notions. They suggest things that we can start wrapping our head around, whereas God has become sort of an empty name, which can obtain some content later on, but we can't use that as a beginning point. Here you see like a radical split between philosophy and some sort of theology. Although what Hegel's doing could be understood as a type of theology as well. I don't want anyone to get upset and object that. So he says, even if speculative truths are affirmed to this subject, their content lacks the immanent notion because it's present merely in the form of a passive subject, with the result that such truths readily assume the form of mere edification. A lot of our God talk, according to Hegel, doesn't really amount to much. It may make us feel warm and fuzzy. God is love. That's not actually teaching us something. But if we say being, or the singularity is love, now we're actually starting to dig our heels in and sink our teeth into some sort of meat, you could say. So he says, from this side, too, the habit of expressing the speculative predicate in the form of a proposition, and not as notion and essence, creates a difficulty. And this difficulty is not an absolutely insurmountable one, but it's one that can be increased or diminished through the very way in which philosophy is expounded. If, for example, we were to try to reduce Hegel to a textbook, we'd be increasing the difficulty, because the textbook is going to use the tired old subject predicate. Predicates really just mean accidental qualities. We already know everything to begin with. I'm just communicating the knowledge. There's no experimentation. There's no excitement. There's no witnessing, truth itself developing over time happening with the textbook. What about commentary? What about what we're doing right here? Good question. I leave that one up to you to think about. Are we doing something that's just sort of trotting out old formulas? Hegel means this, Hegel means that. This is equivalent to that, and that's equivalent to this. So therefore, we can have it all set up, and it all makes sense. Is that what we're doing right now, or are we trying to follow along with the dialectical development that he's tracing out for us, and seeing it not as something that just was traced out once and for all in 1807, but something that we could ourselves participate in and get to know anew? I hope it's the latter. So he says.
And this is why I really like doing this show, right? This series is because I'm doing it like it's another layer of this. Like I don't even have the book in front of me. I'm reading the words still from the book, right? But I'm doing it on a week by week basis. So that's interspersed with the other things I'm reading and other things I'm thinking about and other stuff I'm doing. So I'm drawing completely different connections than what Hegel probably intended. But at the same time, I'm still following, the text. I'm still following his path, if you will. That's why I like Dr. Sadler, because he explains to me, some of the path that I would have missed if I would have done this by myself, right? If I would have done this, just picked up a book and started reading it, it would be like I'm trying to cut through a forest with no map, right? With no understanding of who came here before. But, watching these videos, it's like I'm still going through the forest, but now I have a guide, right? So make sure I don't get lost out in the in the woods, way off the beaten path, and I get nothing from it, right? So yeah, I think it's really cool to be able to do these sorts of things, and I hope other people, in 10 years or something, 20, 50 years, goes back and watches maybe my videos and does their own reactions, and so I'm like their buddy, their commentator, their time traveling kind of ghost that's traveling through the woods with them. I'm not really a guide, but I'm providing my own commentary that goes along with the guide. Yeah, I think that's a good way of doing it, right? As a ghost, that would be an interesting game that I would think about it, where it's kind of like Kojima's game, Death Stranding, right? Where there's multiple people playing the game at the same time, but you're not in the same world. It's just different instances. And so when you're, traveling through the woods of knowledge or whatever, somebody is making comments and figuring out this, then you have a guide who actually read through the text and knows a whole bunch of this stuff. So they're, giving you an idea. In each successive player or each successive play time or whatever is giving you a different, thing to look at, right? A different thing they noticed. Going way off here, but I just find this super interesting.
It creates a difficulty that can be increased or diminished through the very way in which philosophy is expounded. In keeping with our insight into the nature of speculation, the exposition should preserve the dialectical form. Why? It should admit nothing except insofar as it's comprehended in terms of the notion and is the notion. Why? Well, because if the form doesn't, to some degree...
I'm sorry. It just reminded me of that meme. Like, what? The Haitian's like, puck up, pup. So, I'm sorry. Way off. Let me. I wasn't even paying attention. Let me back up.
It should admit nothing except insofar as it's comprehended in terms of the notion and is the notion. Why? Well, because if the form doesn't, to some degree, resemble the content, then we've got a weird sort of dichotomy here, where we're trying to do all this, radical stuff over here with the content, but we're going to do it in the same old tired way. Now, what are the implications for this? The implications for this is that Hegel is doing philosophy in a new way, not just by approaching new topics or, dealing with the topics in a different way, but by presenting it in a different way, by laying it out for us in a way that demands some changes on our own part, having to do with the way in which we're accustomed to thinking about things.
Yeah, you can't just, read a summary of this and be like, yeah, I got it. No, this is why you have to read the whole thing and go through it step by step. Because it's taking you through a specific way of doing things, right? This reminds me of what I was reading about in terms of math, like how they figured out imaginary numbers. They figured it out because the process of doing geometry or doing algebra. No, this was before algebra, right? Doing geometry was like actual squares and stuff like that. Look up The Origins of Imaginary Numbers by Veritasium. But it goes into how they had like little squares and they would move things around and say, okay, this is how you figure out how many the missing side in the square or whatever, right? um, by actually moving physical objects around. But the imaginary number, once they started doing like formulas and stuff like that, basically algorithms to figure out an algorithm as in a step of uh, a series of steps, showing you the process of how to do a thing, right? They were able to figure out that if you do it this way, right, you come up with this thing that doesn't make sense, like negative numbers and like how you get that, right? Turns out you get it by using three-dimensional geometry, or moving things in a different rotation, right? And you wouldn't be able to have it. You wouldn't have been able to figure that out if you didn't, kind of abstract and think about it from a different perspective. So likewise, for like philosophy and things like that, sometimes we have to, look at it from a different perspective and go through a different, um, movement, a different form, right? A different way of thinking in order for us to figure these things out. So yeah, really fantastic stuff. As always, and this was just great. I really love this series. So yeah, thanks for watching. As always, let me know your thoughts, what you learned, and yeah, have a great one. See you. Bye bye.